good morning, good evening, or good night, whichever one it is for you, whichever one it is. I'm very glad you're here to join me for this week's video. And we have another wrap up, people. It is the best time of the month, the time of the month to look back on all of the things I read. In this case, all of the books I read in August. Without further ado, let's just get right into it. The first book I read and finished this month was Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy, my very first Hardy. First of all, as for what this book is actually about, because I have quite a lot to say here, we follow Jude. He's our main character. We meet him when he's still a very young boy. It's his coming of age story, basically. He's an orphan and he moves into the English countryside with his aunt, who is a very particular kind of lady. She's not very nice to him. He discovers his love for the ancient Greeks, or literature in general, but ancient literature particularly. And he becomes obsessed with the idea of education, of educating himself and of going to university. Because near the town he lives in, there's a slightly bigger town, and that slightly bigger town has a university in it. And that becomes his pinnacle of achievement. He wants that so badly, to go to university and get an education. That is the basic premise. And then we follow his life because things do not go to plan. And becoming educated, going to university when you are poor and do not have anyone or anything to support you is very, very difficult. And we get to see that firsthand through Jude. Above all else, this is just about Jude trying to find his place in the world, trying to achieve his goals and just become a person. And we follow him through tumultuous relationships. We've witnessed all of his struggles and difficulties. It is a very interesting book. It's the kind of book where the first few chapters, I was so mind blown because I had rarely had this feeling of, well, you know, when you start reading a book and you feel like it's the perfect book for you, like it's exactly what you were looking for. That's the feeling I had here. I underlined so much. I just loved every single second of being in those chapters. The thing is, the further I read, the more my enjoyment diminished. The first few chapters were really the highlight for me. It didn't end up being quite as good as I had hyped it up in my head. The reason I actually picked it up is because I knew going into it that this is the last book Thomas Hardy ever wrote, because it was so controversial upon publishing that it made him never want to publish anything ever again, because he got so much hate for what he wrote here. And I just needed to, I became quite curious, to be very honest. And the interesting thing here is there's a foreword by Thomas Hardy himself that he wrote, I think, about a decade after this book was originally published. He addressed in that foreword everything that was going on. He addressed the controversy. He addressed his feelings towards the controversy. He basically talked about just how disillusioned that made him, how misunderstood he felt. One of the things he was addressing here was that he got very criticized for his portrayal of the female characters in this book. There was this one critic specifically, it was a female critic, who said no woman would ever have written something like this, would ever have written these women the way Thomas Hardy did. He didn't quite deny it, he just said that was not what he was intending to do here, but maybe he did something accidentally that he wasn't meaning to do. Maybe he came across as more judgmental or mean than he actually tried to be. I kind of admire that, when you don't just shrug off criticism but actually consider it properly, and that he seemed to do here. So I tried to go into this book as open-minded as possible, and I gave him every benefit of the doubt. To go into it, I'm gonna start with the positives because I think that's just a better way to start. The things I really loved about this book was, first of all, the writing, especially in the beginning. It's beautifully written. Jude is a very complex character. He's imperfect, but he's done very realistically. And specifically just the love for literature this boy and later man has, it stays consistent. And literature and history as well. History is also an element here because they are so interconnected in this case. And at its core, this is a work of criticism towards marriage and educational systems and also society at large. And that was well done, I think. Also, religion is a huge thing here. Religion tied to marriage, but just to life in general. As for the things I disliked, and this is where the criticism comes in, because I do think the criticism Hardy actually addressed in the foreword is valid here. I think the portrayal of women was not well done. First of all, I'm not quite happy with the way Hardy wrote women in general, but in itself, yes, there are bad people out there, and some of them are women. It's not like every bad person out there is a man. And yes, women can be cruel and manipulative and selfish, and that is fine. It becomes a problem when only the women in your story are bad people, and when every single villain of your story is a woman, and all of the men are victims of the female species you create in your story. In itself, these characters did not feel like caricatures. I think specifically the cousin character here, she feels like a vivid person. You could actually diagnose her with very particular kinds of diagnoses, and she feels like she could be a real person. She actually feels like maybe Hardy knew someone like her, and that is why he wrote this character. But it's just every single woman, and some of them are really just caricatures. The men are treated with so much more grace than the women are. At a certain point, that took away so much from my enjoyment of the story, because I became so frustrated with it because it was so one-sided and so incredibly obvious. It made me sad because, again, this book had so much potential to be a new favorite, but yeah, sadly it was not. That was Jude the Obscure. And then I actually read Far from the Madding Crowd, also by Thomas Hardy, because I had to know if the portrayal of women was something that was singular to Jude the Obscure, or if it was gonna carry on throughout his other work as well. So I needed to read at least one more by him because I didn't want to judge him, and I wanted to read it quickly so everything was fresh in my mind, so I could basically compare them one-on-one. Far from the Madding Crowd is set in the Wessex countryside, and it follows the entanglement and obsession that this one farmer, Gabriel Oak, has with this woman, Bathsheba. I'm not quite sure how you actually pronounce her name. I'm very sorry. This woman who moves there, she's a very particular kind of character because she's a very independent woman. She becomes a landowner. She basically takes on the role of a man without being entangled with a man, which is quite cool because she's not the kind of typical character you read about in books of this time. There are many more male people here who become quite interested in Bathsheba, I would say is our main character. We follow her predominantly and her entanglements with different men and different people and just her life in this town she moves to. Things become very complicated, and I would say above all else, this is a critique of gender roles. That is the main aspect here. And society at large, religion as well, and marriage too. But gender roles are the main motif here. I quite liked this actually, and this is what I found interesting because I don't think Thomas Hardy is the best person to write women. It is often very clear that a man wrote these women. They say and do things that I don't think a woman would do, but I like the intention behind it. And I think Bathsheba is a very cool main character, how independent and how strong-minded she is. And I like that. She's a very kind person as well. She helps other people. She has a lot of empathy for people. She's very stubborn in the coolest way possible. She has so much dignity, and I liked reading about her. This is kind of where Thomas Hardy redeemed himself a bit. It's kind of boring, to be honest, because most of this is just description of farm life, because most of our characters here are farmers. We learn a lot about what farmers did. That is interesting to a certain degree. I just don't need to read like 400 pages of it. That was Far from the Madding Crowd. Next up, this is actually an audiobook, because I needed at least one audiobook this month. I listened to 11/22/63 by Stephen King, which is a book I've been hearing so much about recently. Everyone seems to be reading it right now, and I became so interested in it, and so I had to listen to it this month. I love Stephen King as audiobooks. They feel so cool, like such an escape, and I find them so entertaining. 11/22/63 is the date of Kennedy's assassination, and it's one I'll never forget now because I will never forget this book title, which is kind of cool. We follow Jake, who is a very normal high school teacher. That is what he does. He does it well. He's a good teacher. You like him from the beginning. He's a very sympathetic main character. Circumstances occur and he becomes able to travel in time, specifically to the 1950s, the late 1950s. And he sets out to try and prevent the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It explores the complexities of a situation like that. Being able to travel in time, being able to change time, and also the rules behind it, because Stephen King set up a set of rules that he isn't free to do just anything. There are real consequences for the things he does, and it's really hard to change time. I really like that motif of time not wanting to be changed and time basically fighting you not to be changed. Mundane daily life of the 1950s and 60s, I found that so fascinating to read because I think it was really coolly done. I felt like I was traveling back to that time in America. There's also obviously a lot of moral implications of being able to change time, specifically for a thing like this, because the assassination of John F. Kennedy, if you want to prevent that, you have to kill a person so they don't kill Kennedy. But what if that person didn't kill Kennedy? How can you be absolutely sure? Specifically because the assassination of Kennedy is one of those things that are quite controversial, with a lot of conspiracy theories around them. Is it justified? Is it morally okay to kill someone to prevent them from killing someone else? And how do you value one life over the other? How do you justify making yourself into a god of sorts? It's such a philosophical, moral dilemma. I like the thought processes I was able to create through reading this, the things I was able to think about while I was in this story. As a thought experiment, I guess you could say, this is just super cool. I liked it a lot. I liked the basic premise. I liked the main character. I liked the story. The thing I didn't like is how predominant the love story was. In itself, I wouldn't be opposed to that. It makes this thing so much more personal for the main character, and it makes his decision more difficult, and it makes the whole thing more complex. So in itself, that's cool. But I just don't like the way Stephen King writes relationships. I think they're too sexualized. I think they're really strangely done. They are not the kinds of relationships I can be involved in and that I can believe are actual, real, profound relationships. That is a very individual thing. Don't let it keep you from trying out 11/22/63. After that, I read The Empusium by Olga Tokarczuk. My very first Olga, and definitely not my last. I have to tell you right off the bat, I read quite a few of her books this month, and I fell in love with this author. I don't know what's up this year. It's just, there's so many favorite potentials, or new favorites actually. I have not loved a single one of her books. The Empusium, I'm so glad I started with it. And honestly, I think it's my favorite by her. I can't say it for certain yet. We'll need to let some more time pass. But this is very, very The Magic Mountain-esque. The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, but this is much better in my opinion. We're set in September of 1913, and a young man, who is our main character, moves to this guest house in this resort town. A health resort in the Silesian mountains. It has nice air, there is a lake there, there is a sanatorium, it's where people go who have tuberculosis or other kind of health issues, and our main character is very, very sickly, so he goes there to hopefully recover. He cannot move into the sanatorium itself because it's full, so he moves into a guest house near the sanatorium. There he meets several different men, all very interesting kinds of characters, different backgrounds societally and educationally as well. Every night they take this hallucinogenic substance of sorts, and then they have conversations, and that has a really strange effect. This entire story, of course, the subtitle here is A Health Resort Horror Story, which this really is a very sinister kind of story. I loved it. I loved every single part of it. For one, just because of the conversations these people have, they are so interesting. They're philosophically deep, but also incredibly funny at the same time. These are obviously all men. And they cannot, the whole joke here is they cannot agree on a single thing because they have such vastly different opinions on things, and any discussion they have leads to a fight basically, or at least a very strong disagreement, unless they talk about women, because on the topic of women they can all agree. Okay, I found it. I can only read it to you on my phone because I haven't subtracted my Kindle highlights onto the original copy, the physical copy yet, but just bear with me. This is, wait for it. Woman is like, here he sought the right word, an evolutionary laggard, While man has gone on ahead and acquired new capabilities, woman has stayed in her old place and does not develop. This is why a woman is often socially handicapped, incapable of coping on her own, and must always be reliant on a man. She has to make an impression on him by manipulation, by smiling. The Mona Lisa smile symbolizes a woman's entire evolutionary strategy for coping with life, which is to seduce and manipulate. On the topic of women, they all had something to say. It doesn't do this book justice at all, though, so let me just find one more quote so you can appreciate how beautifully this book is written. He would rather take the risk that one day this world too would disappoint him, and that he would have to run away again, escape to yet another, more distant location, to avoid falling into the arms of that familiar, hopeless state in which one was simply a bother to oneself and others. Did he fear that they would peel away his carefully constructed image of a person who is on good terms with himself, who feels all right about himself, and is sure of his own opinions? We are shaped not by what is strong in us, but by the anomaly, by whatever is weak and not accepted. The soul is the weakest thing within us. So now I hope you have a better idea of just how beautifully Olga writes, because that is really what stunned me the most, just the beauty of this writing. Also, it is so clever because there is so much humor in it. The main character, Voynich, I'm really sorry, but I have no idea how to pronounce his name. This is such a precious, precious person. There's just such an abundance in here of beauty, of complexity, also of sinister aspects. What I find interesting here, though, because it's a very unexpected kind of horror story, in my opinion, it's not outright scary, but what makes it sinister and what makes it sort of unpredictable and scary is the people themselves, because the entire time something is clearly very off here, but you're never quite certain what exactly that is. Also, one thing that's quite random, but I think it's just a testament to how good Olga is as a writer, is the main character. He has this huge fear of being watched, and the narrative style plays into that because the narrator breaks the fourth wall and is basically narrating us watching the main character. It's so intelligently done. I could go on and on. There's also so much commentary on trauma, on repression, on toxic masculinity and misogyny. It's the exact right thing for someone like me. If you have a similar reading taste to me, if you tend to like the same books, I think this is going to be a definite hit for you. So maybe check out the Empusium. Then, of course, I also had to read Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. It's also a really good one. It's about this woman who lives in a tiny little small Polish town. You can't even call it a town, really. She lives on this plateau with like 7 other houses, and she takes care of those houses in winter because most of the people don't actually live there full time. They only come there in summer, and so it's only her and 2 other neighbors that permanently live there. At the very beginning of the story, a murder happens, and it is not going to be the only murder here. This book is mysterious, full of intrigue. Its creepiness, exactly like in the Empusium, doesn't actually come from the situations themselves, but from the people. The fact that you do not know what to expect of these people. They are unpredictable, and that makes it so scary. To me, those are the scariest kinds of stories. The stories about the cruelty of people, just humans. It's so quietly disturbing. I think that's the perfect way to describe this. Quietly disturbing. The main character, she's a vegetarian, and she is very quirky. She's extremely passionate about animal rights and just fighting against animal cruelty, the way people treat animals. She calls that out so often, and she is so angry at people and at the hypocrisy of how people treat animals. The vegan in me loved this. I've already said this, but it's just, this is the perfect kind of book the main character was so much more relatable than she probably should be. And I loved her so much more than I probably should have. She's one of my favorite main characters of all time now. I really, really loved her. Above all else, why I love this story so much is, for one, of course, it's just the atmosphere in general, the snowiness, the crampedness, the way it's written, the main character and her quirkiness, and just being inside of her head was so enjoyable. The writing, again, beautiful. Olga is such a good writer. The thing that I loved the most is the way she called out the numbness, the societal numbness towards how cruel we are to animals, and how desensitized we are to that, and how normalized it is, and how angry that makes you. And again, it's so funny at times. Olga has a really cool humor. We are on first name basis, by the way. Yes, we are. Such a good book. That was Your Plow over the Bones of the Dead. I can finally say that name properly now. After that one, I read The Ambassadors by Henry James. I don't even know how many of his works I've read by now, maybe 4 or 5. The Ambassadors is the story of a man whose fiancée tasks him with going after her son to basically retrieve him from London. And he's supposed to bring the son back to America to stop an entanglement, a mysterious entanglement he has with one of the women he's met there. But it's really mysterious, it's really ambiguous, you never quite know, or for a very long time you don't actually know what's going on. We are also set in Paris for a while. It skips kind of between London and Paris. We follow the main character as he meets the son, as he gets involved with that social circle, and as he starts to question and doubt his motivation. Through that lens, Henry James criticizes or poses the question of how you should live your life. If you should live it according to societal expectations, or if you should actually follow your own heart and what you think is right for yourself. And what even does this concept of living a good life mean? The main character does struggle a lot with himself. He's lived his entire life thinking a certain way, and now he's suddenly being thrust into this situation where he has to start probably thinking a lot differently. And that is interesting. The turmoil he goes through, I found that quite interesting. My problem here is just, I found it meandering. I found the characters to be very oblivious. It should have probably just been a lot shorter. I think another issue is that I've just read a lot of these kinds of stories, and Henry James himself has written a lot of these stories already, so it didn't feel like I was being told anything new or revolutionary or in any way surprising. The characters weren't really that intricately crafted. You didn't feel very, or at least I didn't feel extremely invested in their stories or in the progression of this plot. Again, the pacing is my main issue. Portrait of a Lady and The Turn of the Screw are still by far my favorites. Those are perfect representations of how good he can be. I don't think this is a representation of that same thing. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's a nice story. It's just not ever gonna be one I reread or really think about ever again, I don't think. That was The Ambassadors. I read A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. Again, I don't quite know if that's actually, there's a hair here, oops. Don't know if that's actually the way you pronounce his name. But this is a book I picked up because one of you pointed it out to me. I already talked about this a bit. One of you told me that this is basically tailored to my reading taste. Our main character is Count Rostov. We are set in 1922 in Moscow, in Russia. He basically wrote a really politically charged poem during the tumultuous revolutionary time in Russia. The beginning of the 1900s in Russia, I think this is quite common knowledge, was extremely tumultuous in Russian history. Yeah, he writes this politically charged poem, leaves to Paris and doesn't come back for a long time. And when he comes back into a Russia where the monarchy has been abolished, where things are a lot different, and where the fact that he's a count is now basically offensive to people because he is nobility and people don't like the things nobility stands for. Nobility at this point in Russia is an outdated and hated concept. And so he is condemned to house arrest in this one hotel. He's in his 20s. He's so young. And he is now condemned to lifelong house arrest in a hotel. That is basically all. That is the story. We follow him throughout his life in this hotel, trying to come to terms with the fact that this is where he's gonna live out his entire existence now. The book shows you his attempt at making the best of this life. He spends a lot of time in his memories and in his nostalgia. It also deals with the fact that memories are tied to objects and to places. The change of times in general, the difficulties of that transition of the traditional to the modern is very, very well done here, because this main character is really, in a way, just collateral damage to this change of regime that is going on here. He's just a really nice guy. He loved his life. He never offended anyone. He never did anything bad. He was just born as a nobleman, and he enjoyed his life as a nobleman. Of course, he could have questioned his role more. He could have tried to do more good things, of course. But at its core, he's not a bad person. He didn't do anything wrong. That does feel kind of unfair, because he's such a likable guy. The fact that he is in a hotel, that in itself is so interesting, because hotels are transient places. People don't stay there. People leave constantly. But he can't. He cannot leave this place. And so, although he is constantly surrounded by all of these people, he is kind of all alone. The more he tries to become accustomed to his life and make the best of his life, the more he attempts to make relationships. And some really precious relationships are created here. I thought this was a really perfect kind of book to escape your life or to comfort you. Because yes, the themes themselves, there is depth here. Social critique, there's philosophy here. There's a lot of talk about literature, the Russian classics specifically. Tolstoy is mentioned, Dostoevsky is mentioned, Turgenev, Pushkin, all the great ones, Bulgakov, because at this time Bulgakov is a contemporary, so you basically read from the time Bulgakov was in. This is not a book that's hard to read, which is really nice. It's also easily written. It's so easy to get through. It's such a quick read. Just overall, I thought it was a really good book. I'm so happy I picked it up. So thank you, Will. This was a perfect recommendation. Then when I can't hold up because I don't own it, because again, I listened to that one, it's Dolores Claiborne by Stephen King. It's maybe his most unique. It's unlike any of the other Stephen Kings I've ever read, because it's composed entirely of one monologue that our main character, Dolores Claiborne, is holding as she's being interrogated for the presumed murder of an elderly lady she works for. She has been her housekeeper for years and years, and this elderly lady has now suddenly fallen down the stairs and died, and Dolores is being accused of her murder. And the monologue is her in interrogation defending herself and also explaining her entire life story, basically, because she's like, I didn't kill that one, but maybe I did kill someone else, and here's why. It's so interesting because that is so hard to pull off. A monologue for, like, I don't know how long the book actually is, but I presume about 300 pages or so. It's not a short book. It's really, really interesting because it wasn't boring at all. It feels so vivid. This main character, because you hear her talk for so long, she feels so vivid, so realistic. The entire story just came alive because of it, which is such a hard thing to pull off. The book itself, however, is very difficult to get through. It's about toxic marriages, mistreatments of children and of spouses, about abuse, so much abuse. It is basically a revenge story of sorts, of a woman trying to avenge her situation, trying to avenge the things that have been done to her and her loved ones, and trying to gain or regain autonomy in her life, about breaking the cycle and the incredibly high price that can come at. It made me physically ill. It made me feel so icky reading it at times or listening to it, just because, I don't know, the nature of that story just doesn't allow for any other feeling, in my opinion. That is the goal here, and so it is well done. It's not a feel-good kind of story, but I think it's a very important kind of story, and I think Stephen King did this woman and this book and these subject matters a lot of justice. Check out the trigger warnings, because there are a lot. It's one of those things Stephen King just likes to spring them on you without any warning, so maybe let me be your warning. After Dolores Claiborne, I read James by Percival Everett, which is a book that has been on my TBR for a few weeks, months at this point. And the reason I have been refraining from reading it is because I thought I probably would like to read Huckleberry Finn first, because that's the book this was inspired by. And I like to read that first if something is inspired by another book, especially if it's a classic. I really do prefer reading the classic first because I just like having the context. But in that case, Huckleberry Huckleberry Finn is not a story I'm interested in. But James is a story I am so interested in. And I thought it would be such a shame to just wait years and years until I've read Huckleberry Finn. So I just decided to go for it and to read this now. And goodness, am I glad I did. This is the story of James, who in Huckleberry Finn is just called Jim. In Huckleberry Finn, he's basically just a plot device as far as I know. In this story, James, he's given his own story, his own character, his own motivations, his own personality. He is highly educated. He has a family, a wife and a daughter he loves. At the start of the story, James finds out he's going to be sold, forced to separate from his daughter and his wife. Because of that, because he does not want to be separated from his family, he decides to run away. At the same time, Huckleberry Finn, who is also a character here, has also decided to fake his own death and run away because his abusive father has come back into town. And they go on this journey, but we follow James, and James gets all the spotlight here deservedly because my God, is he an incredible character to read about. First of all, the story is incredibly paced and so beautifully written, but not overly complicated. It's really accessible. And it deals with its incredibly heavy themes in such a good way. It does them such justice, and every one of these characters feels so dignified, but their situations are just so tragic, and that is so well portrayed. The amount of work these slaves have to put into making themselves seem inferior and seem dumb in order to ensure what minuscule amount of safety they have by making white people feel superior. In German, there's this word called schreiend ungerecht. It basically means something is so unfair you want to scream. That is what this book made me feel like. So unfair, you want to scream. Although it is so difficult, it is also such a dignified portrayal of the resilience and the strength of these completely innocent people who are relentlessly oppressed and prosecuted for absolutely no reason and treated in the most horrific ways imaginable. There's so much dignity here too, so much love and so much just loyalty and so much humanity. Also the writing. Listen to this. Which would frighten you more, a slave who is crazy or a slave who is sane and sees you clearly? Also this one. If one knows hell as a home, then is returning to hell a homecoming? Even in hell, were there such a place, one would know where the fires were just a little cooler, where the rocks were just a little less jagged. And so it was in my hell. There was my family. There were the bad things, the cesspit, the patrolling overseers. Another really precious aspect of this story is the power of literature and how being able to read and write is such a powerful thing. The quote on the back says this perfectly. It's a quote of the story itself. It goes, "With my pencil, I wrote myself into being." That was James by Percival Everett. All right, let's see here. Next up, I read In Memoriam by Alice Wynne, which is another book that's been on my physical TBR for quite a while. This is the queer love story of Sydney and Henry, who attend boarding school together in the English countryside during the First World War. We meet them in 1914 as the country gets more and more involved and as boys get more and more pressured to go to war. You see all of the complexities of that. It's a really fascinating juxtaposition because on the one hand you have these two boys just trying to become okay with who they are, come to terms with their own sexuality, with this really complicated fact of maybe falling in love or developing feelings for your best friend. Also the backdrop of a boys' boarding school, which is quite the interesting factor here, and just the varying personalities that are explored. The author, Alice Wynne, first of all, this is insane, but this is her debut novel. I kept being so astonished by that because her writing is unbelievable. It's so beautiful, it's so stunning, but it's not like, it's the perfect mix of poetic writing, but not like overly flowery in any way. I felt like she really did such a good job at developing these characters. She made sure to make this as historically accurate as she possibly could, and you really felt that. It felt so historically accurate and so believable, therefore. What I found incredibly compelling and what made this story feel even more real than it already did is there will be interspersings of the honor roll, which is basically just the newspaper article of that week or of that month of the soldiers that have passed away during the war. And as our characters become more involved with that, you will often be left on these cliffhangers where you don't know what actually happened at the front. And so reading this honor roll that's then interspersed after certain aspects of the story will just make you so tense, because you read this honor roll and you look for the characters you've come to know and love. That feels like a bit of a recreation of what people at the time must have felt reading these honor rolls. She based these on actual real-life newspaper cutout. Of course, the nature of this story, it being queer and the time it is set in, is quite, well, it lends to quite the difficult subject matters that are explored here. But I think Alice Wynne managed to uphold a very nice balance between it being real and deep and exploring the difficult aspects of what that means for these men, but also not being overtly gratuitous in any way. I thought Alice Wynne also managed to create a great balance between the actual love story and the aspect of war in this book. I think the war taking on such a huge part of this story and taking on such a dominant role is the most realistic thing ever. For one, from the psychological repercussions on these soldiers specifically, but also the family members, anyone who was affected, and the different ways in which these people were affected by the war, but also the physical reality of it made me feel so sick, because I think it was so well done. It felt so realistic. Just overall, I think this was a very, very successful story. The writing, the characters, the story itself, the historical accuracy. So yeah, I really, really appreciated this story for everything it did. After that, when I read This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald, which is my second Fitzgerald, I read The Great Gatsby and I loved The Great Gatsby, and I wanted to see if that was an outlier among his body of work or if he is just a good writer. Because knowing what I know about F. Scott Fitzgerald's life, I really wanted to dislike him, to be very honest. I don't believe in the concept of separating the art from the artist. So yeah, I would have really liked to dislike his books, but with The Great Gatsby, I loved that one so much. And so I needed to know. This Side of Paradise is the coming of age story of Amory Blaine. And it is heavily inspired, at least as far as I know, from Fitzgerald's own life. Growing up and coming of age in the 1920s. He comes from a wealthy family, and you follow him in school, in college. You follow his multiple tumultuous relationships, platonic and romantic. Really, he goes through quite a lot of development, which I liked. I found that cool. But to be very honest, I don't think this was as good as The Great Gatsby. I don't have that much to say about it. I think it was quite average. The writing was good, but not as good as The Great Gatsby. And the characters, well, I liked them, but I didn't love them. I don't think the story stuck out in any way, which isn't a bad thing. It's just, it's not on the level that I was expecting it to be, going off of what I felt reading The Great Gatsby. The concept of societal rise and fall and societal standing, social class is quite a predominant part here, which I liked. I think that was maybe the most interesting aspect of it. But yeah, other than that, it was just very, very average. The main character did develop a lot, which was nice. I really have very little to say about this story, I think you can tell. But a story I have a lot to say about is Maurice, or Maurice. I'm actually not sure how to pronounce that name. It's E.M. Forster's most personal work. Maurice is the story of Maurice. He is our main character. We follow him as he grows up. We meet him as a fairly young boy. He goes to school. He lives the very much normal life of a wealthy man in the early 1900s, but he always has felt very different from other people. The insight into the psyche of this boy is beyond anything else. It makes him feel so human. He enters college, and in college, that is where his entire perspective on life completely alters, and his perspective on himself as well. He goes through such a character development, and this is the story of Maurice trying to come into his own, trying to become okay or realize and stand by his sexuality. Of course, that is made much more difficult by the time he lives in, by the prejudice he faces, and by just the inacceptance. There are so many parts here that make you so angry, but that are clearly very realistic and clearly things that will have happened so often, sadly, and that probably still do. But it's also just such a nice love story. Maurice meets this boy in school, in college, who he falls in love with. It's his very first experience with falling in love. Later, he meets this other dude named Alec, who in different ways makes him realize different things about himself. And it's so complex. It's so well done. It's incredible. It's beautifully written, but not overtly complicated. Just listen to this. Once inside college, his discoveries multiplied. People turned out to be alive. Hitherto, he had supposed that they were what he pretended to be, flat pieces of cardboard stamped with a conventional design. And then, but he saw that while deceiving others, he had been deceived and mistaken them for the empty creatures he wanted them to think he was. No, they too had insides. But, O Lord, not such an inside as mine. As soon as he thought about other people as real, Maurice became modest and conscious of sin. In all creation, there could be no one as vile as himself. No wonder he pretended to be a piece of cardboard. If known as he was, he would be hounded out of the world. I think this perfectly goes to show just how much struggle this boy faces and how much struggle accepting your sexuality came with, especially at a time like this where you were met with so much prejudice. I don't know, it's so well done. I just keep saying that because I can't stress it enough. It's such a good book, it's such a good story, and it does this subject matter such justice. For anyone who doesn't know, Maurice actually has quite the sad backstory because Forster wrote this in 1914. He never published it. It was only published in 1970 after his death. So he never got to see the impact this story has because this is very much one of the founding, fundamental queer classics. It's so sad to me that he never got to see that. The thing I love the most is the afterword, and I'm actually going to read you part of the afterword because I think this is basically Forster addressing the reader, telling us about what he was trying to do with this book and what it meant to him, which is so nice because that way we get some of his input, some of his thoughts about it. And I found that so incredible. And reading the afterword made me tear up. All right, Forster writes, "It was finished in 1914. The friends, men and women to whom I showed it liked it, but they were carefully picked. It has not so far had to face the critics or the public, and I have myself been too much involved in it and for too long to judge. A happy ending was imperative. I shouldn't have bothered to write otherwise. I was determined that in fiction anyway, two men should fall in love and remain in it for the ever and ever that fiction allows. And in this sense, Maurice and Alex still roam the greenwood." Doesn't that just make you tear up? It definitely makes me feel very, very emotional. I don't know, I feel like I got to know Forster on such a different level now because I've read quite a few of his works, but none of them have felt this personal and have been this personal. And I appreciate that so much when an author allows you to look inside of their brain and inside of their heart in a way, which might sound cringy, but I don't know how else to put that into words. It feels like a privilege and it feels like such a gift. It feels like so much of himself went into this story. I loved it so much. It was such an impactful read to me. It's so good. I don't know what else to say. And because I just couldn't stop with Forster, I loved Maurice so much that I needed another Forster. I just didn't want to leave his writing behind just yet. And one of you, Paul, thank you, Paul, actually recommended this one to me. And so I decided to pick up A Passage to India, which as far as I know is the only novel by him I hadn't read yet. So I think as far as novels go, I have now read everything by him. I may be mistaken though, I'm not quite sure, I need to look into that. A Passage to India is basically about British colonialism in India. The story centers around Dr. Aziz, who is a young Indian Muslim. He's a doctor. Dr. Aziz comes into contact with these two women, Mrs. Moore and Adela. They have just entered India, and Adela is basically trying to become engaged. That is sort of the main premise. And then this instance happens where Dr. Assis takes several of the English people to these caves that are in India, basically on this little tour where he tries to bring them more into contact and show them the Indian culture or the culture of the place they are in specifically. This visit to the caves leads to an accusation that is put towards someone by someone else. I won't go into that because I think you should read that for yourself. That has devastating consequences. That really exposes every one of these English people, even the ones that have seemed kind or forthcoming to this point. It exposes them for all of their prejudice and their uptightness. The ridiculous ego of these English people would be laughable if it wasn't so incredibly devastating what tragic effects that can have, and if it wasn't so destructive. You don't really want to believe it, but you have to, because this is very realistic. Beyond the obvious criticism and commentary on colonialism on a whole that this book obviously contains, there's also a lot of commentary on racial prejudice, of course. Then also the cultural misunderstandings, how deep set that is and how devastating it can be in its effects. But above all else, it's about the power imbalance that is created through colonialism. I really liked it. Of course, you cannot say it's perfect because in some ways it is a product of its time. It's not what we would nowadays call politically correct. But I think the intent is there. And I think that is very well done here because you can tell what Ian Forster was trying to put across here. And I think he did a good job. Again, it's well written. These characters, although very frustrating at times, were real and vivid. They felt like real people, which is always a good thing. It makes the story easy to read. It's a bit meandering at points. It's not the most fast-moving plot. And there's a certain point where you think it's going to be wrapped up now, but the book keeps on going. And to me, it made India feel like such a vivid and such a beautiful place. It also shows you just the beauty of Indian culture, of these different religious festivals that they have. The balance was really nice. There isn't just the horrors that I've just described. It's kind of a love letter to India and the Indian culture in a way. A good book. Ian Forster is a good writer. So yeah, that was A Passage to India. And finally, the last book I read in August was The Garden Party and Other Stories by Catherine Mansfield, which again, another one of you beautiful people recommended to me. It's the month of recommendations by you guys. I love that. I'm going to start taking so many more of your recommendations now because all of these were such successful reads. This is a collection of short stories that my attention fell on because you told me that Catherine Mansfield was a writer Virginia Woolf admired. In very many ways, Catherine Mansfield's writing feels so similar to Virginia Woolf. I've never read an author where I can genuinely say sometimes I had to remind myself that this was not Virginia Woolf's writing. From the introduction of this story, I got to learn a bit more about the context of that. They both, Catherine Mansfield and Virginia Woolf, seem like they're such characters. I've always loved Virginia Woolf for that. She seems like such a character. And Catherine Mansfield gives me a lot of the same vibes. And they seem to have this almost frenemy kind of relationship. They seemed almost antagonistic at some points, but you could clearly tell by the way they wrote about each other that they respected each other so much. Virginia Woolf said she could talk to nobody, to no person, as she could talk to her about writing. She is one of those very unique cases who only ever wrote short stories. She never wrote an actual novel. And I think that's so cool because just from reading this is a collection of 15 short stories. She's a master of that form. She's one of the best writers of short stories I have ever read. She's like among Virginia Woolf and Shirley Jackson, in my opinion. She is so good, and I loved every single one of these stories. There is some connecting themes like family, like grief, death, life, nature, so much nature, such beautiful writings. The complexities of human life. I think that's the overarching term here. Such a nice overview of her work. I'm definitely going to be acquiring her completed works because I need to read all of her short stories. She writes beautifully and so uniquely. My favorite among them definitely has to be At the Bay. It's the first one of the stories. It just gives you the most summery vibes ever. From the very first sentence, it just came alive. in a way that I rarely experience, especially in short stories. It's so difficult to make a short story not only feel like, these characters feel believable and feel realistic, but also make it feel just so creative and so unique. Some of these are quite abstract. Some of them do the thing that Shirley Jackson always does, or often does, where at the end the entire story is put in a different perspective. It's just so well done. It's something I can't quite put into words, but I highly recommend her. Catherine Mansfield was from New Zealand, and many of these stories are actually set there. At the Bay is one of them. At the Bay is just the story of this really small town on the coast and the many people who live there. I love her. I'm gonna need to read all by her, and I am so glad I discovered her. So maybe do give her a shot. I highly recommend that. And with that, we are actually done. The Garden Party and Other Stories was my last read of the month. I did also spend quite a bit of time reading The Books of Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk, but I have decided, as I said in my last video, I want to take my time with that, and so it is gonna be carried over into next month. I'm at the 60% mark, I think. I am loving it. I will, however, be keeping my thoughts to myself until I've actually finished the book. So that is one I kind of half read. That was all. Those were all of the books I read in August. What a successful reading month once again. I'm so lucky with all of these books I read. I'm so lucky with all of you who keep recommending me all of these good books. I'm definitely going to keep taking your recommendations. I encourage you to bring them my way. Discovering gems I'd never heard about is just, it's the most special feeling. Thank you so much for watching, for being here, for letting me ramble on about books. I hope you're having a nice day. If you are not having a nice day, that is fine too. I'm thinking about you either way. I highly appreciate you being here, and I already look forward to seeing you again next week. And until then, bye-bye.